Welcome to Parlor Talks. If you're an owner or manager of a label, folding carton, flexible packaging, or corrugated packaging printing company, this podcast is for you. We'll dive into the latest trends, innovations, strategies, and best practices shaping the package printing industry.
I'm Kaylee Vandewater, Senior Content Editor for Packaging Impressions, and your host for this episode of Parlor Talks. For today's episode, I'm excited to be speaking with Sara Osorio, Manager of EHS and Sustainability at Printing United Alliance. So thank you so much for joining me today, Sara. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Kaylee.
Absolutely. So obviously you're super knowledgeable about sustainability and everything tied into the printing industry as a whole. And I know I've personally heard you speak at several events on a wide range of sustainability things. But today I really wanted to talk to you about like the sustainability of packaging materials and label materials that printers and converters are actually using. So I think the materials are a lot of the time what we think of when we think of sustainability. So like the substrates, inks, coatings, all that. What are some of the most promising innovations in this space that you've seen gaining traction in like actual production environments recently?
Yeah, so innovation in the printing industry is happening every single day. And I think it's something that I'll talk about a lot during today's podcast because I say that word a million times in any other interview or podcast that I do. Some of the most promising innovations that I'm seeing right now in the sustainability space for printing and packaging, I think the first big one is going to be fiber-based packaging and this massive trend towards paper and fiber. Also, monomaterials and lightweighting is something that's really coming into play right now because of all of the extended producer responsibility legislation that is being passed and introduced in the US. And then I think my personal favorite, just because I find it so interesting, is the major advances that we're seeing in inks, coatings, and adhesives that used to be a pretty big barrier towards recyclability for packaging, but there have been so many advances in this space that really are shaping the future of printing and sustainability.
Great. So when converters are picking substrates, like what sort of metrics do they need to look at? Like what sort of like information should they know about the materials that like help them decide if it's a sustainable option for them?
Oh, yeah. So that is a great question and one that I would say has like a million answers because choosing the right substrate for packaging for a product is going to be very product specific. So I would say look at attributes rather than metrics. And the first thing that I would say is a good starting point, if it's available, is looking at a life cycle assessment or an LCA, because this is really going to give the printer or converter the big picture of the packaging. Because a lot of times, or at least right now, a lot of the focus for sustainability and packaging is going to be on the end of life. So what happens to the packaging after, it's been used, but it's a much bigger picture. So if you look at an LCA, it's going to give you the impacts of the product from the raw material to the production, to the use of the product, to the end of life. But end of life is very important. And I know that that's something that converters are very focused on right now because of extended producer responsibility. All the kind of the buzzwords that you hear right now are recyclable, compostable, biodegradable. And like I said, EPR is just putting such a massive emphasis on this. So even though end of life is not the whole picture, I would say if you're looking for those sustainability attributes, things that you can look at are post-consumer recycled content or pre-consumer recycled content, the weight of the material, the composition of the material, the carbon footprint of the material. So looking at an LCA is really gonna give a full picture of the product, but I know that there's a lot of focus on end of life. So I would say for end of life, those are the big ones right now.
Printing United Expo is where the entire printing industry unites under one roof. Explore cutting-edge technology from over 800 exhibitors, see live product demonstrations, and discover solutions that can transform your business. With exclusive education sessions, expert insights, and endless networking opportunities, this is the must-attend event for anyone in print. No matter your role, Printing United Expo delivers the innovation, connections, and knowledge to help you stay ahead. Join us this October 22nd to 24th in Orlando. Learn more at printingunited.com and experience the future of print today.
So, in terms of the performance piece of evaluating a material's sustainability, is there like a certain balance that converters and printers need to like try to strike? Like, is there ever a point, for instance, like there's a material that might be super sustainable, but like when you actually run it in production, the performance issues that come up make it actually less sustainable than something else?
Yeah. So a package is only going to deliver the intended environmental benefits if it does the job correctly. Because let's say that you were choosing, some sort of substrate, whatever, plastic, paper, I'm not even going to pick one in specific, but it's not protecting the product in the way that it's supposed to, then that's actually going to lead to losing product, wasting that packaging, and that's going to lead to more waste. So picking something that seems more sustainable because it's more recyclable or maybe has a lower carbon footprint isn't actually going to deliver the intended environmental benefits if it's going to end up as waste. So you have a little bit of this paper and plastic dilemma, but instead of asking what material is more sustainable, I would instead ask which material delivers the lowest total impact for one specific application, because this is going to be very, very product specific. So it's not just choosing, paper versus plastic or recycled versus virgin raw materials. It's more about choosing a solution that's going to deliver the right performance with the lowest environmental impact across the full life cycle of that product and packaging.
Gotcha. And I know there's also been the trend in paperization in the industry. And I've heard people on both sides of the issue. Can you talk a little bit about the sustainability of paper and plastic substrates? And are there instances where paper might be the most sustainable option, and then another instance where plastic is the more sustainable option versus paper?
Yeah, so there is absolutely a massive trend towards fiber-based and paperization in the industry. And I think there's a lot of drivers for that. I think the first and main driver is that paper is highly recyclable, widely accepted, and there is really not that much consumer confusion around whether paper is recyclable or not. It just tends to be. And I will kind of pinpoint this again. It is widely accepted across most all recycling infrastructures around the country. Like I said, it has very established infrastructure. It has strong consumer perception of being recyclable. People usually think plastic and immediately think pollution. Paper doesn't have that. Paper kind of is the opposite. People immediately think sustainable and green when they think of paper. And I also think plastic is seeing a lot of regulatory pressure right now from a lot of different avenues, from bans on certain plastic products to bans on toxic chemicals in plastic products. Plastic is under a lot of fire when it comes to legislation, but paper can have disadvantages. Life cycle assessments have shown that paper in many cases can have a higher carbon footprint because it is much heavier. So transport emissions tend to be higher, and you usually need more material to achieve the same function because it doesn't have that strong protective barrier that is offered by plastic. And then another limitation for paper is that because paper has that reduced barrier performance, sometimes it needs what I like to call like these extras, so extra coatings or extra processing to match plastic's performance. So these can actually reduce recyclability because you have these hybrid solutions that are paper plus a plastic coating, and they're marketed as paper, but they behave like a multi-layer packaging, so they can compromise recyclability and LCA outcomes. When it comes to plastic, LCAs have shown that it can have a lower carbon footprint because it is much lighter and it obviously has superior performance, but it has major end of life disadvantages, and consumer perception around plastic, like I said, is very negative. They see it as toxic. The whole thing around microplastics and pollution right now is huge. So I think when converters are trying to make these decisions, it's really going to be a balancing act and looking at the key trade-offs, because a lot of times in this case, you're looking at carbon emissions versus circularity, and neither one of them are going to win because they're both equally important. It just depends on what you're focusing on with that product. So you can have a really lightweight plastic pouch that's going to have lower carbon emissions than a heavier paper alternative, but it's not going to be as recyclable. So it's not that paper is good or bad. It's just very context and product dependent. You asked me in what cases plastic is better than paper, or vice versa. Paper will perform very well if it is storing dry goods, if it is storing things that don't need a very high moisture barrier. But when you get into wanting to protect products that need that high moisture barrier, high protection, that is where plastic is going to excel every single time.
Okay. So I know we also mentioned monomaterial solutions earlier. From a converter's perspective, does it actually make things more sustainable to use monomaterial, or does it introduce new challenges in production that offset those benefits?
So the short and simple answer to that is yes, I do believe that monomaterials can improve sustainability in practice, but as with anything in sustainability, it is not that simple. So why are monomaterials gaining so much traction? Flexible packaging is usually made up of multiple layers, each one serving a different purpose to protect the product. And when you eliminate all those layers, it makes it easier to mechanically recycle the product because you don't have that incompatibility. Mechanical recycling likes simplicity. Mechanical recycling does not like a combination of things. It sorts plastic, it grounds it, but it likes things to be very simple. Where things get complicated with flexible packaging and with materials that have that multi-layer, is that if it's not properly managed, I'm sorry. Where things get complicated with monomaterials is that if they're not properly managed, it can introduce trade-offs that are going to erode the benefits. So the first one, we've talked about it already, is obviously going to be that performance trade-off. We talked about it with paper, but it's the same thing with monomaterials. The reason why those multiple layers are there is because those layers serve a purpose. So if you're going into a monomaterial, you're losing the ability to mix and match the protective and important properties of these layers. Processing and runnability is also going to be an issue that converters will likely run into in the beginning. When you're switching to a new substrate on press, it is going to behave differently. So there is going to be a period of learning, trial and error, and adjustment. And one important point that I always like to make is that monomaterials improve recyclability, but this is still very dependent on infrastructure. And the infrastructure, or the recycling infrastructure in the US, is extremely outdated, and flexible monomaterials are not universally recycled at high rates. So even if a monomaterial is more recyclable, if it's not recycled within a specific jurisdiction or a specific area, it's probably going to end up in landfill anyways because the infrastructure is so old. So again, it always comes back to this balancing act act where converters are going to have to optimize across several different parameters like designing for recyclability, performance, process efficiency, because sustainability is only going to happen when all three of these align. When you are designing for recyclability, when there is high packaging performance, and when you can process that substrate efficiently in your plant. Because like I said before, if you are sort of just maximizing on one of them at the expense of the other two, then that's going to lead to loss of substrate if it's not running through the press correctly. That's going to lead to loss of product due to poor barrier performance, which then gets you into more food waste, which is, sort of another layer to this. So in the bigger context, I think monomaterials are directionally correct because they are sort of in that mindset of being recyclable right now. But I don't see monomaterials being a universal solution for everything, just because with sustainability and with our industry, everything, again, it's so product and so context specific that not everything is going to be a one size fits all solution.
Gotcha. And we've talked a lot about substrates so far, and I think they get a lot of the attention when we're talking about sustainability. But how often are like the inks and the coatings or adhesives the like real limiting factor when it comes to recycling the end product, the end of life, or composting it, or anything like that?
Yeah, this is a great question because I think for a long time, these were actually what I call sort of like the hidden gatekeepers of sustainability. Um, and I've talked about mechanical recycling a little bit, but I'll just sort of give a 10,000-foot overview of how the process works. So mechanical recycling is a process of sorting, grounding, washing, and then reprocessing plastic into pellets. And the key here is that washing part. So when the plastic is being recycled, after it's ground up, it goes into a hot caustic bath that will remove inks, coatings, residues, impurities, anything from the plastic. What was happening is that these inks would bleed and stain the wash water and stain the recyclate, which then lowers its quality and value. And then what was happening with adhesives is that the adhesives would turn into like these really sticky gels and would clog the machines, which would slow down operations, increase downtime, and reduce how the materials can actually be recovered. But there's actually been a plethora of innovations. And like I said, sustainability is about innovation, innovation, innovation. It happens every single day. We see it in our industry every day. And there are so many modern solutions to these problems. We are seeing things like de-inkable and washable inks. So what will happen with these inks is instead of them, sort of bleeding into the wash, they have been reformulated to sort of congeal and float to the top so it does not stain anything and they can be easily skimmed off. Another really incredible innovation that I've been seeing within printing is these magnetic inks. So they formulate these inks with metals in them that can actually use the magnets that are already present at the material recovery facilities to separate the labels with the magnetic ink from the recyclable materials. We're also seeing coatings and primers that will hold the ink in place until it goes to the caustic bath wash, and then it will release with the ink, preventing the ink from staining. And then there's also been a lot of advances within adhesives that won't gel and won't cause that sticky residue that that clogs up the machinery. But I do, again, want to make a point that a lot of the issues that we see with recycling right now is because US recycling infrastructure is so very outdated. It just cannot handle a lot of the materials that technically are recyclable. For example, like carbon black. I know that, the packaging industry remembers the carbon black fiasco that happened a couple of years ago. And, they were wanting to ban carbon black because they were saying that black plastic wasn't recyclable. But it's not that black plastic is not recyclable, it's that it can't be sorted because the machines don't see it.
So I know we talked about carbon footprint a little bit earlier. And I recently, actually, the last podcast I recorded for Parlor Talks, I talked to some people who've been working with UV carbon negative algae based ink. And it's carbon negative, so it's taking carbon like out, where a lot of things I think are, I guess, carbon positive or have, carbon in them. Um, do you do you see carbon negative solutions as a meaningful way for packaging and label converters to improve their sustainability efforts? And that could be like in any of the materials, not necessarily my ink example that I had.
Yeah, absolutely. I think carbon negative solutions are going to be very important. They are hard to achieve. I mean, the fact that they have achieved a carbon negative black pigment is extremely impressive. And what should be pointed out, because I have read about this algae black pigment, it is traditional carbon black. It is just derived differently. It's not derived from petroleum, but it is carbon black. These solutions are extremely promising, I think, for our industry. Unfortunately, at the moment, they're just not scalable. They don't have the capacity to support the entirety of the industry. But again, sustainability is about innovation. Innovation is happening every single day. And I do see more solutions like this coming into play for sure.
Okay. Um, we talked about a lot. So this might be overwhelming for some converters out there. So if you're a converter and you're trying to navigate all of this, what should be like the main focus right now to make sure you're making progress on sustainability?
Yeah, I think the hardest part right now for converters and the issues that they're facing is that there's a lot of pressure to embrace sustainability, and there's a million options all claiming to be the most sustainable. And I think chasing them all is a really good way of burning resources without making any meaningful process. So I think my biggest advice to converters would be selective with innovation, but don't stop innovating. Look at different ideas, talk to your customers. What do they need? But then also, most importantly, be that resource for your customer because you are the packaging expert, not them. So guide your customers towards, those sustainable solutions. And then my last sort of advice would be extended producer responsibility is here. It is not going on anywhere. There are legal challenges, there are lawsuits, but I think in general, the trend towards EPR is going to continue. So converters that are shipping into states that are covered by EPR, start tracking data, start tracking metrics, start tracking information that your customers will probably be asking you for in the near future in order for them to comply and pay the fees into these EPR programs. And the last thing I would say is, like you said, I know that sustainability can be very, very, very overwhelming, but a sustainability journey is just that. It's a journey. It's not an endpoint. You have to take it one single step at a time. How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? How do you complete a sustainability journey? One step at a time. If you try to do everything at once, it's going to be too much and you're not going to make any progress. Go little by little. What are your customers asking for? What impact, like what areas of sustainability are most material to your company, and go from there.
Gotcha. All right, so that about wraps up our time together. So thank you so much, Sarah, for taking the time to chat with me about material sustainability in the packaging and label segment. It was a pleasure and I learned a ton, and I hope everybody else listening did as well.
Thank you,
So
Katie,
thank you
for
for joining.
having me.
Absolutely. Thank you.